Empires are born in hunger, but the Han rose from exhaustion. Out of Qin's ashes walked a commoner, Liu Bang, whose defiance kindled 4 centuries of unity. His reign tempered conquest with mercy, and his descendants turned ruin into order, creating an empire that would define China's soul. Scholars replaced warlords, plows outlasted swords, and heaven's mandate became a mirror for human endurance. Yet every piece carries its shadow: ambition, intrigue, decay. The Han Dynasty was not merely a kingdom, it was a rhythm of rise and renewal, the moment when China learned that endurance itself could be power. Near the ruins of Xianyang, the road ran straight through fields that no longer yielded harvests. Travelers passed in silence, their carts loaded not with grain, but with bones from abandoned graves. Once, this had been the imperial heart of the Qin Empire, the first realm to call itself united under heaven. Now its milestones leaned like gravestones, and the bronze seals of its officials lay buried beneath the dust. Among the stragglers moving east was a man in a torn officer's robe, his belt heavy with a sword he had no right to keep. Liu Bang, a minor sheriff from Pei County, had been sent to deliver a convoy of laborers to the emperor's tomb. None of them expected to return alive. Those who served the dead emperor rarely did. Somewhere between the checkpoints, a summer storm flooded the roads, and several prisoners escaped. The law was clear: failure meant death. Faced with the choice between punishment and rebellion, the officer of Pei drew his sword, broke the remaining chains, and told the men that if they must die, they would die as free men. That moment, half desperation, half defiance, was the spark from which his legend began. The freed laborers, hardened by years of forced toil, chose to follow him. They fled into the hills of Mangdang, where ruined forts from older wars still stood. At night, their fires flickered among the stones like the scattered eyes of ghosts. From this small band, the peasant uprising found its unlikely captain. The empire he turned against was already rotting. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, had ruled through terror and uniformity. He had built a state of perfect obedience, roads of one width, writing of one script, thoughts trimmed to one doctrine. His vision bound the land together, but it also bound every man to the yoke of labor. Corvée workers died by the tens of thousands on the Great Wall and in the tunnels of his tomb. Taxes came in harvests that never reached the villages. When the emperor died in 210 BC, his officials hid the news, carting his corpse eastward in a sealed carriage surrounded by barrels of rotting fish to disguise the smell. Within months, the deception collapsed, and so did the empire. In the countryside, rebellion spread like a rumor made of fire. At Dazexiang, 2 officers, Chen Sheng and Wu Guang, refused to face execution for a delay caused by rain. They turned their soldiers against their superiors, crying that the great man is dead and the world belongs to all. Peasants took up wooden spears. Scholars dug up forbidden texts. Nobles unfurled ancestral banners hidden since the unification. The empire splintered faster than it had been forged. Across the southern plains rose another contender, the scion of an ancient house, the warrior Xiang Yu of Chu. Where the sheriff of Pei was coarse and impulsive, the noble of Chu was precise and proud, a man who believed that conquest required spectacle. He commanded tens of thousands and fought with a ferocity that made even his allies tremble. Yet both men, the rustic rebel and the born commander, were drawn toward the same collapsing center, the capital of Qin. By 207 BC, the imperial armies had withered, garrisons deserted, generals turned their coats, and the once mighty fortress of Xianyang stood hollow behind its walls. The man from Pei reached it first. His forces were a patchwork of farmers, deserters, and ex-slaves, scarcely disciplined yet bound by loyalty to the only leader who treated them as human. The gates opened without a fight. Inside, the conqueror walked through avenues lined with carved beasts and silent courtiers. The palaces still smelled of incense. The mirrors still reflected an emperor who was no longer there. He climbed the marble steps, looked upon the empty throne, and said nothing. Instead of plunder, he declared amnesty. "We fight tyrants, not the people," he told his soldiers. In that act of restraint, the commoner proved himself greater than the empire he had overthrown. For the first time in generations, the people of Qin saw soldiers who did not steal their grain or burn their homes. Hope, thin as smoke, returned. It lasted less than a month. When the noble of Chu arrived with his host, he saw in the silent city not the promise of renewal, but the symbol of tyranny. He ordered the palaces looted and burned. The fire consumed lacquered halls, libraries, and archives. Centuries of knowledge turned to drifting ash. Witnesses claimed that molten bronze ran through the streets like rivers. For 3 nights, Xianyang blazed so brightly that farmers hundreds of miles away thought dawn had come early. Thus ended the First Empire, buried beneath the same flames that had built it. In the ruins, the conqueror of Chu divided the realm among his generals, creating the so-called 18 kingdoms. Each lord received a province, each province a grudge. The rebel of Pei was granted a remote frontier called Han, a narrow strip of mountains and river valleys that bordered the western deserts. It was meant as a dismissal, not a reward. But humility has a longer memory than pride. While the warlord of Chu feasted in palaces of looted jade, the new ruler of Han rebuilt his army. He recruited farmers who sought protection, welcomed scholars who fled purges, and listened to counselors wiser than himself. Among them was Zhang Liang, a strategist once hunted by the Qin, who taught him patience, the art of letting arrogance destroy itself. In this patience lay the future. War soon returned. The noble of Chu, unable to tolerate rivals, marched west to crush his former ally. The campaign that followed became legend, the Chu-Han contention, a 4-year struggle that turned central China into a chessboard of sieges, ambushes, and betrayals. Armies switched sides as often as rivers changed course. Villages vanished between battles, their fields salted by passing troops. Yet amid this shifting chaos, the man from Pei endured. He lost more fights than he won, but he never lost twice in the same way. When beaten, he retreated. When cornered, he negotiated. His rival, certain of destiny, mistook flexibility for weakness. By 203 BC, the balance began to tilt. The conqueror of Chu's forces had grown weary, his supply lines thin. His advisors warned that heaven favored endurance over brilliance. He ignored them. In the winter of 202, both armies met in the valleys of Gaixia, where cliffs hemmed in the plain and frost silvered the reeds along the riverbanks. The rebel of Pei commanded less than half his enemy's number, but his generals were men who had learned the cost of failure. Among them was Han Xin, a master of maneuver, who devised the plan that would end the war not with swords, but with sound. On a moonless night, thousands of soldiers of Han raised their voices in the songs of Chu, the ballads of the enemy's homeland. The melodies rolled across the valley, echoing from hill to hill. The warriors of Chu, hearing their own tongue in the darkness, thought their countrymen had deserted to the other side. Panic spread through the camps. Some wept, others fled. The noble of Chu, waking to the chorus, understood too late that his empire was already unraveling in the minds of his men. At dawn, the army of Han descended. The field dissolved into confusion. Horses plunging through mist, banners trampled underfoot, commanders shouting orders no one heard. By midday, the once invincible warlord was surrounded. He broke through the lines with a handful of riders and fled south to the banks of the Wu River. There, exhausted and bleeding, he refused the ferryman's plea to cross. "Heaven has doomed me," he said, and cut his own throat beside the water. The river carried his blood toward the sea, and with it, the last claim of the House of Chu. When the news reached the rebel camp, there was no triumph, only silence. The fields were thick with corpses, and the frost had turned red. The victors gathered around their commander, now a man without an enemy. He stood on the hillside overlooking the plain of Gaixia, the wind lifting the banners that bore the single character for Han. For the first time, the mandate of heaven had passed to a man born among the people he ruled. In 202 BC, he entered the old city of Chang'an and was crowned Emperor Gaozu of Han. The ceremony was simple compared to those of his predecessors. No alchemists promised immortality. No armies dragged stone statues into tombs. He poured wine to the heavens, swore to rule with moderation, and declared amnesty for the defeated. The nobles knelt, the drums sounded, and the commoner of pay became the first emperor of a dynasty that would outlive him by 4 centuries. Yet as the celebrations echoed through the half-rebuilt city, the new emperor's eyes often drifted west, toward the burned lands of Qin. He knew how quickly glory could decay. The empire he had won was a patchwork of loyalties held together by exhaustion. The generals who toasted his victory were already measuring their reward. The peasants who had followed him for freedom now waited for peace that might never come. Still, beneath the fatigue of war, a foundation had been laid. The Qin had proved that China could be ruled as one. The Han would learn how to make unity endure. On that winter morning in Chang'an, the sheriff who had once broken his prisoner's chains began the harder task, breaking the habits of tyranny without losing the order it had built. Morning light seeped through the unfinished lattice windows of the new palace at Chang'an, spreading in pale squares across the damp stone floor. The air smelled of lime and fresh timber. A lone figure walked its length, his hand brushing the columns as though testing whether they were strong enough to bear a throne. He had slept once among soldiers and fugitives, but now, crowned with the weight of empire, he found that silence could feel heavier than war. Survival came before glory. The war that had united the realm had also hollowed it, leaving behind burned villages and empty fields. A starving country could not be ruled by edict. So the new emperor sent proclamations to every province, promising amnesty to deserters and relief to those who returned to the plough. Those who till the soil, he wrote, feed heaven and earth alike. It was a gentler voice than any throne had spoken in a generation, and the people began to listen. But mercy alone could not steady a crown balanced on swords. Victory had birthed a new class of lords, men who had fought for him and now expected reward. Han Xin, Peng Yue, and Ying Bu, heroes of the revolution, each ruled provinces as personal kingdoms. Others, bound by blood to the throne, governed in the emperor's name but answered to no one. To remove them meant war. To indulge them meant weakness. Caught between loyalty and fear, he divided the empire between imperial commanderies and semi-autonomous vassal states. It was a compromise born of fatigue, and within it lay the seeds of the next rebellion. Beyond the palaces and gates, the work of reconstruction began. The new ruler kept much of the Qin bureaucracy, but stripped it of its cruelty. Collective punishment was abolished, forced labor was limited, minor crimes were met with fines instead of mutilation. In place of fear, he offered predictability. The officials who once knelt trembling before the Qin court now learned to speak without terror. For a time, it seemed that moderation itself might hold the empire together. Yet power has its own gravity. The generals who had marched beside him now eyed the throne as if it were a prize won jointly but kept by one hand. Suspicion crept through the court. The laughter that had once echoed through army tents faded from his voice. The founder of Han had learned that victory binds men by necessity, not devotion. One by one, necessity began to fade. To the north, another danger gathered, beyond the wall. Scouts returned with tales of riders whose arrows carried black feathers, the mark of the Zhongnu. These nomads, heirs to the tribes that once humbled the Qin, had resumed their raids across the border. Their horses moved faster than any army could pursue. Their tents appeared and vanished like mist. In council, ministers urged a show of strength. The emperor, unwilling to seem weak before his own generals, took command in person. The campaign ended in humiliation. At Baideng, surrounded by horsemen in the winter snow, his army went 7 days without food. Frost clung to their armor. The wind sang through the arrows embedded in the walls. Legend said the emperor stood on the ramparts at night, watching the campfires of the enemy flicker like constellations. Only by the cunning of his envoys, who bribed the wife of the Xiongnu leader, was the siege lifted. He returned to Chang'an thinner, humbler, and convinced that strength lay not in battle, but in endurance. From that humiliation was born the Heqin, the marriage alliance. To buy peace, the empire sent princesses and caravans of silk, wine, and grain northward in exchange for quiet borders. Many in court cursed it as a national disgrace. The peasants, spared the cost of endless war, called it wisdom. The ruler who had once risen through defiance now preserved his people through concession. His soldiers whispered that he had grown cautious. His enemies called it prudence. Within the palace, another force was shaping the future. Empress Liu Ji, his companion since the earliest days of exile, now shared his counsels and his nights of uneasy sleep. She had been captured once by rival warlords and had escaped only through wit and resolve. Those who met her eyes learned quickly that pity had no place there. When the emperor's health faltered, her influence deepened. He laughed when ministers complained. "She ruled my house when I had none," he said, "so let her help rule the empire I've found." Her loyalty was beyond doubt, but her love was made of iron. She saw danger in every ambitious man. When reports reached the palace that Han Xin, the brilliant strategist of Geixia, was plotting rebellion, she urged immediate action. The emperor hesitated. Han Xin had won him the throne. Yet hesitation is the slowest form of surrender. One morning, guards seized the general inside the palace gates. He was executed in chains, his titles erased. The empress watched without expression. Soon after came the downfall of Peng Yue, accused of conspiring with the same phantom rebels. His corpse was quartered and displayed in the marketplaces. Even Ying Bu, once a brother in arms, took up arms in fear and was crushed in turn. By the 6th year of the dynasty, the great captains of the revolution were gone. The empire was quieter and lonelier than ever. Beyond the palace walls, peace began to bloom again. The capital transformed from a camp of soldiers into a living city. Chang'an, rebuilt along a strict grid, shone with symmetry. Wide streets lined with cypress led toward the Changle Hall, the palace of perpetual joy. granaries filled with grain from the south. Canals brought water from the Wei River, and the markets overflowed with silk, bronze, and salt. Children who had known only war grew up watching festivals instead of battles. To them, the emperor was not a conqueror, but the father of a new age. He often rode among them without escort, stopping to drink with farmers in the shade of mulberry trees. Once, when a villager offered him a bowl of rough wine, he drank it whole and said, laughing, "A ruler should never forget the taste of his people's labor." Such moments spread through the countryside faster than decrees, and the people loved him for them. Officials, less charmed, whispered that their emperor had remained too common for his crown. Age, however, cares little for affection. The wounds of Gaixia ached in winter, and the old soldier who had survived 100 perils now fought his own body. Physicians prescribed elixirs of mercury and crushed jade. Each cure worsened his sickness. His appetite waned, his temper grew brittle. When he could no longer sit through court sessions, he ruled from a couch piled with fox furs. His eyes dim, but his mind unbroken. In those final years, the palace became a field of quiet conspiracies. Sons from concubines vied for favor. Ministers aligned with factions. The empress watched everything, sharp as a hawk, determined that her own child, Liu Ying, would inherit. She placed her brothers and nephews in high posts, weaving a web of influence that reached every chamber of the court. The emperor noticed, but rarely protested. Perhaps he lacked the strength to fight her. Perhaps he trusted that her ambition would guard what his courage had built. In early 195 BC, the founder of Han called his final assembly. Wrapped in robes of crimson silk, he sat before his ministers, his voice unsteady but clear. "The empire," he told them, "is easy to seize, but hard to keep. When the people eat their fill, heaven smiles. When they starve, no army can save us." Those present wept, knowing they would not see him again. That night, he asked for wine, toasted the moon above the courtyard, and said, "I once chased fortune through smoke and rain. Now let me rest." He died before dawn. His passing unleashed a silence more dangerous than war. The empress wept at his bier, but her hand already held the seal of state. Within days, their son was crowned Emperor Hui, a boy too gentle to rule and too wise to protest. The court bowed to the dowager as regent, unsure whether reverence or fear guided their gestures. The woman who had survived exile, humiliation, and betrayal was now the most powerful figure in China. Across the plains, people mourned in simpler ways. They called their dead ruler the commoner emperor, the man who had risen from dust to clothe the world in order. His funeral procession stretched for miles, flanked by peasants scattering handfuls of millet along the road. At the Changling Mausoleum, a tomb shaped like a low mountain. His body was laid beneath layers of jade and silk. Wind swept through the mourners' banners, crimson fading into dusk. Apart from the crowd, the empress stood motionless, her veil fluttering in the cold. Some said her tears were genuine. Others said they were merely habit. Behind her, the drums beat in slow intervals, marking the end of one life and the beginning of another. The age of conquest had closed. The age of control was about to begin. What the founder had built through endurance, she would protect through calculation. And in the quiet halls of Chang'an, where sunlight fell across uncarved stone, the promise of peace already cast the shadow of fear. Morning returned to Chang'an, not with drums of war, but with the sound of hammers striking stone. Carpenters clambered over scaffolds. Masons patched walls still scorched from older fires. For the first time in decades, the capital's rhythm came from labor, not from marching feet. The empire that had been conquered by a peasant's sword was learning the slower discipline of peace. Behind silk screens in the Changle Hall, Empress Lu Ji ruled as regent for her young son, the new Emperor Hui. Courtiers called her the Dowager, but her presence filled the court like a mountain's shadow. She spoke rarely and smiled even less, yet her commands carried across the empire with a precision her husband had never achieved. The widow of the founder understood that power, once seized, must be shaped or it would consume its owner. The boy she ruled for was gentle and curious, a scholar trapped inside a crown. He preferred poems to proclamations and fed cranes in the palace gardens, while his mother decided the fate of provinces. Her decrees carried his seal, but not his will. The throne's voice had changed timbre, no longer the laughter of a soldier, but the cool certainty of an administrator who intended never to surrender control. Outside the city walls, the land slowly began to heal. The fields that war had abandoned sprouted again with millet and wheat. Old irrigation ditches filled with spring water. Farmers rebuilt their homes with clay and bamboo, using roof tiles scavenged from the ruins of Qin palaces. Caravans returned to the roads, hauling salt from the coasts, silk from the south, iron from the northern hills. Prosperity, tentative as a sprouting reed, began to lift its head. The Dowager Empress watched this recovery with a merchant's eye for order. Her government reduced taxes, standardized weights and measures, and restored the postal stations that had fallen into ruin during the wars. She retained the Qin bureaucracy, but replaced its terror with procedure. Records were kept with a precision that astonished foreign envoys. Grain tallies were checked twice before reaching the capital. Efficiency became its own form of worship. Still, the memory of rebellion lingered. Many of the generals who had once followed the founder into battle still commanded provinces as personal kingdoms. Some were kin to the throne, others were remnants of old alliances. They were proud men, each with soldiers loyal to him alone. To leave them unchecked risked another civil war. To challenge them outright would ignite one. The Dowager chose a subtler path. She promoted their sons to positions at court, binding ambition to comfort. Titles multiplied, but power thinned. Within the palace, she began to weave a new web of loyalty, one tied not to the Liu bloodline of her late husband, but to her own Liu clan. Brothers, nephews, and cousins were placed as governors, chamberlains, and commanders of the imperial guard. Every appointment looked routine. Together, they formed a wall around her authority. Ministers who questioned these choices found themselves reassigned to distant frontiers or retired by sudden illness. What the founder had bound by friendship, the widow secured through fear. Justice under her reign took on a ritual precision. When a magistrate was accused of extortion, she ordered him tried publicly on the palace steps. Crowds gathered to watch as he knelt and confessed before the people he had robbed. The sentence, exile rather than death, seemed merciful, but humiliation achieved what punishment never could: obedience. In this way, the Empress taught her officials that fear, if administered carefully, could be clean. The young emperor grew increasingly uneasy. He had inherited his father's warmth without his strength. Seeing executions and public confessions, he pleaded for leniency, only to be dismissed with a glance. A ruler, his mother told him, must choose between pity and order. The first dies young. That prophecy, whispered at a dinner table, would prove cruelly exact. Beyond the borders, the Hekin treaties with the Xiongnu continued to hold. Each spring, envoys carried carts of silk, grain, and wine northward as tribute in exchange for peace. Soldiers despised the arrangement, but the farmers blessed it. A full belly, the empress said, is better defense than a high wall. While the cavalry drilled idly on the frontier, settlers moved into the northern valleys, turning the contested lands into farms that would one day anchor the empire's strength. The years that followed saw prosperity deepen, though unease traveled beneath it like a shadow. The court began to whisper that the dowager's ambition reached beyond stewardship, that she meant to build a second dynasty from her own blood. When one of the emperor's concubines bore him a son, both mother and child vanished before dawn. When his half-brother questioned a tax decree, he was found poisoned in his bed. None dared accuse her openly. She ruled through the quiet terror of inevitability. Yet her governance was not without vision. She funded the rebuilding of canals destroyed in the wars and reopened the great road that linked Chang'an to the eastern provinces. Taxes were codified to scale with harvests rather than fixed quotas, easing the burden on poor farmers and swelling imperial revenue. Artisans, freed from corvée labor, returned to private workshops. Their bronze and lacquer goods filled the markets once more. The empire, under its iron-hearted matriarch, began to breathe again. By her 10th year as regent, the dowager empress had turned necessity into permanence. The boy emperor had grown to manhood, but his power remained ornamental. When he protested her executions or her favoritism toward her clan, she dismissed him from council, claiming he was unwell. Ministers understood that their allegiance belonged to the voice behind the curtain, not the one on the throne. To defy her was to vanish. It was the emperor's compassion that doomed him. Unable to endure his mother's cruelty toward his own kin, he fell into despair and illness. In 188 BC, at the age of 23, he died, quietly, perhaps mercifully. The official record attributed his death to fever. The people called it grief. Behind the palace walls, no one asked further. Power passed fully to the woman who had long wielded it anyway. Without a direct heir of her own line, the dowager elevated child emperors drawn from the Liu clan itself. Infants were crowned amid ceremonies too splendid for their trembling hands. Ministers bowed to their cradles while the regent ruled from behind screens. Across the empire, coins bore the emperor's name, but the Liu emblem beside it, a phoenix rising through clouds. The symbol spread faster than rumor. Courtiers began to wear it embroidered on their robes, unsure whether it signified loyalty or survival. In those years, the empire reached a strange equilibrium. Trade flourished, roads were secure, and the harvests were abundant. But beneath the surface lay exhaustion. Officials spoke softly. Soldiers saluted too long. It was peace maintained by calculation, not trust. Visitors to court described the dowager as ageless, her face thin as parchment, her eyes hard as polished jade. "She speaks little," wrote one envoy, "and when she does, her words settle like stones in a pond." Age, at last, began to undo what no rival could. The empress who had stared down generals now trembled when signing edicts. She wandered the palace at night, calling for her dead husband, then ordering guards to scour the halls for intruders only she could see. Ministers avoided her chambers. Even her own kin spoke in whispers. In 180 BC, while dictating a decree to her scribes, she collapsed. By dusk, the woman who had ruled China for 15 years lay still, her seal of state resting beside her hand. The news spread through the city before sunrise. Chang'an did not mourn openly. It waited. Soldiers loyal to the founder's bloodline moved quickly, sealing the palace gates and surrounding the mansions of the Liu clan. The coup was swift and bloodless at first, then final. Every surviving relative of the dowager was executed or ordered to take their own life. Their banners, the red phoenix of her house, were burned in the palace courtyards until only ash remained. When calm returned, the ministers convened to choose a new sovereign. They turned to a grandson of the founder, a man of mild character and proven restraint, Emperor Wen. His coronation was modest. He refused the jeweled canopy prepared for him, saying, "Heaven honors virtue, not splendor." The courtiers, weary of intrigue, bowed as if exhaling after years of holding their breath. Under his rule, the empire exhaled as well. Punishments were lightened, taxes trimmed once more, and forced labor suspended except for emergencies. Scholars called this policy Wu Wei, to govern by doing little. It was not laziness, but confidence, the belief that a state properly balanced needs few commands. For peasants who had lived through 3 generations of war and suspicion, it felt like rebirth. Chang'an itself changed with the mood. Taverns reopened, music drifted through the night markets, and travelers arrived from distant provinces to sell jade, copper, and books. The emperor walked among them unannounced, listening to the prices of grain and the gossip of farmers. When an old woman once complained that taxes were still too high, he ordered an audit the next day. His reign, unlike his predecessors, sought legitimacy, not in fear, but in fairness. Within a decade, the scars of conquest had faded into the patterns of ordinary life. Roads once built for armies carried scholars to new academies. Canals dug for war transports ferried grain instead of soldiers. Confucian thought, muted under the Qin and distrusted under Liu, returned to prominence. Philosophers spoke again of virtue, moderation, and the harmony between ruler and ruled. The bureaucracy listened. A new political philosophy was taking shape. That moral balance, not force, sustained a dynasty. Looking back, later historians would say that the long peace began here, in the quiet years after the death of a formidable woman and the rise of a cautious man. The founder had seized an empire by chance. His widow had preserved it through iron. His grandson would teach it how to endure. Beneath their hands, China was becoming not a battlefield, but a civilization. And as the capital's lamps flickered against the river's dark surface, the people of Han, farmers, soldiers, scholars, merchants, could finally believe that dawn would come again, without the smell of burning. Mist hung low over the Wei River as the sun rose above Chang'an, painting the city's new walls in muted gold. On the eastern road, farmers were already leading their oxen to the fields. The wars of the founding age had faded into story, told now by old men in tea houses who began their tales with, "When the empire was young." The Han realm had learned something rarer than conquest, the rhythm of stability. At the heart of this calm stood Emperor Wen, the grandson of the founder. He ruled without the pomp that usually surrounded a throne. His audiences were small, his robes plain, and his halls often unguarded. Courtiers were startled to find the emperor walking the palace gardens alone at dawn, feeding the cranes or stopping to speak with gardeners about the health of the plum trees. When one official protested such informality, he replied, "If heaven sees all men alike, why should I look down?" Wen had inherited not only an empire, but also its exhaustion. The treasury was drained, its people wary of decrees. His genius lay not in creation, but restraint. He reduced taxes to a fraction of what the Qin had demanded, and decreed that no peasant would be taken from his farm for forced labor except in times of flood or famine. The word spread faster than couriers. The emperor wanted his people to live. Soon, the villages began to hum again. Fields long abandoned to weeds were ploughed and seeded. New granaries filled with millet and rice, their stores sealed with the imperial mark, a simple square stamped with the character for peace. For the first time in generations, families could feed their children without fear of a tax collector's knock. Chroniclers would later write that under Wen, a measure of grain bought a measure of happiness. His queen, Empress Dou, shared his moderation, but followed a different philosophy. She favored the quiet introspection of Taoism, teaching that a ruler, like water, should take the lowest place and nourish all things. The emperor listened. Together they cultivated a court that valued frugality, learning, and mercy. The walls of the Changle Hall were no longer lined with the trophies of war, but with calligraphy, maxims in graceful ink that reminded officials, to rule others, one must first rule oneself. Such gentleness did not weaken the state, it steadied it. Grain surpluses became so vast that old storehouses burst, forcing the court to build new ones outside the city walls. Coinage stabilized, markets revived, and merchants began to travel freely between provinces once fractured by war. Along the southern roads, caravans carried silk to coastal ports. From the north came iron tools and horses. For the first time, the wealth of the countryside and the capital flowed in rhythm. In the provinces, governors were ordered to cut their entourages and limit public building projects. When one official constructed an extravagant mansion, the emperor visited it unannounced, praised the craftsmanship, and then imposed a tax equal to the cost of its decoration. Luxury, he said, is best enjoyed once and never repeated. The message spread more effectively than any law, yet restraint alone does not create harmony. The emperor understood that prosperity required trust, and trust came from justice. He ordered a revision of the legal code, replacing the draconian statutes of the Qin with milder penalties. Mutilation, once the common punishment for theft or fraud, was abolished. Prisoners were given the chance to labor for the state instead. A single edict declared, "Better 1,000 guilty spared than one innocent wronged." The empire, which had lived so long under the lash, began to believe in the possibility of fairness. It was in these years that the ideal later generations would call the rule of Wen and Jing began to take shape. When Emperor Jing, Wen's son, ascended the throne in 157 BC, he inherited not turmoil but abundance. The transfer of power was peaceful, so unremarkable that one historian noted, the people scarcely noticed they had a new emperor. In that unnoticed moment lay the truest proof of stability. Jing resembled his father in thrift, but lacked his mother's calm. Where Wen governed through patience, Jing governed through vigilance. He feared that wealth might soften the spirit of the empire, and that the semi-autonomous kingdoms created by his grandfather might again endanger unity. His suspicions were justified. Decades of peace had allowed local kings, many descended from the founder's relatives, to grow strong. Their territories collected taxes independently, their armies trained without central oversight. It was a system meant to reward loyalty, but loyalty had an expiration date. Tension finally ignited in 154 BC, in what would be remembered as the Rebellion of the Seven States. It began when the king of Wu, a distant cousin of the emperor, refused an imperial order to cede part of his land. Others joined him, Chu, Zhao, Jiaoxi, and more, each declaring that the central government had betrayed the founder's promise of shared rule. In truth, most feared losing their privileges rather than their freedoms. The rebellion tested the foundations of the Golden Age. The emperor's armies were smaller than those of the combined lords, and panic swept the capital. But Wen's years of careful preparation bore fruit. The imperial treasury was full, the roads clear, and the generals loyal. Command was given to Zhou Yafu, a stern strategist known for his silence and discipline. He refused to meet the enemy in open battle, instead cutting off their supply lines and sealing the roads that led to the capital. Within months, hunger achieved what swords could not. The rebel states surrendered one by one. When the war ended, the emperor forbade celebrations. "It is a victory over our own family," he said, "not one worth rejoicing." The captured lords were demoted or executed, and their kingdoms absorbed into imperial administration. The rebellion's suppression marked a quiet turning point. No regional ruler would ever again challenge the Han throne with success. Unity, once fragile, had hardened into permanence. After the war, Emperor Jing returned to the policies that defined his father's reign: frugality, leniency, and balance. He reduced penalties for peasants unable to pay taxes and personally pardoned villages that had supported the rebels under duress. When an earthquake struck the capital region, he remitted all debts owed by the affected provinces, declaring that heaven's tremor was a warning against harshness. Such gestures, half political, half spiritual, deepened the people's loyalty. During these decades of calm, learning flourished. Scholars who had hidden their texts during the Qin purges now lectured openly. The imperial archives expanded, and court historians compiled the first systematic records of the dynasty's founding. Scribes worked by lamplight, writing on bamboo slips that clattered softly when stacked together. One observer described the archives as a forest of words where the past grows straight and tall. Technological progress followed scholarship. Iron, smelting, advanced rapidly. New bellows powered by treadle pumps allowed furnaces to burn hotter, producing stronger metal for plows and tools. Agriculture blossomed. Fields once sown by hand were now planted with multi-tube seed drills, an invention that saved time and doubled yield. Water wheels appeared along the lower way, driving mills that ground flour for the capital. These quiet inventions, not the battles of kings, fed the empire's endurance. Trade routes also lengthened. Caravans from the south brought spices and exotic woods. Merchants from the far west appeared at border markets, offering fine horses. The government, cautious of private monopolies, established state supervision of certain goods, salt, iron, and coinage, ensuring steady revenue without extortion. In the markets of Chang'an, a proverb emerged: under a wise ruler, even profit has conscience. Yet prosperity carried its own danger: complacency. Officials began to wear silks thicker than the emperor's. Feasts at court grew more elaborate. When ministers presented a proposal for a new palace with jade floors, the emperor refused. The ruler's house, he said, should not outshine his people's virtue. He ordered the funds redirected to canal maintenance instead. The remark was copied by scribes and recited in schools for a century afterward. Culturally, the age fostered an optimism rare in Chinese history. Poets praised not heroes or gods, but balance itself, the slow perfection of order. One surviving verse from this time reads, "The plowshare cuts where swords once fell. The river runs clear through broken walls. Men sleep beneath roofs of straw and dream of nothing greater than dawn. That dream, fragile yet enduring, was the true legacy of the era." The rule of Wen and Jing became a legend within living memory. Later generations would remember it as the empire's inner spring, a time when government seemed to align with the natural order, when heaven and earth shared the same breath. The treasury was full, the prisons nearly empty, and the people so secure that travelers left their goods unguarded along the roads. Still, perfection is a moment, not a condition. Beneath the calm surface of Han prosperity, ambition began to stir again. Young scholars in the academies debated whether Taoist restraint had made the empire timid, whether destiny required expansion beyond its peaceful borders. Their words found an eager listener in a young prince named Liu Che, who would one day become Emperor Wu. He grew up surrounded by the memory of moderation, but dreamed of empire measured not in harmony, but in reach. When Emperor Jing died in 141 BC, the throne passed smoothly to this grandson of Wen. The people, used to peace, expected more of the same. But change often comes disguised as continuity. The new emperor was barely 16, yet his ambition was boundless. He would turn the quiet empire outward, seeking not merely to rule, but to redefine what China could be. Behind him lay 4 decades of abundance, order, and calm, the greatest gift any generation could leave to the next. Ahead lay expansion, glory, and the long shadow of exhaustion that always follows them. For now, though, the empire of Han stood at its zenith, fertile, united, and serene. The rivers ran clear, the granaries full, and the people believed that peace had become permanent. It was the calm before the age of thunder. Winter lingered longer than usual in the first year of Emperor Wu's reign. Frost clung to the eaves of the palace at Chang'an, and the young ruler, barely 16, spent his mornings watching the ice melt along the courtyards. He had inherited a world in balance, roads unbroken, granaries overflowing, borders quiet. It was a peace others would have cherished. He found it stifling. His tutors called him Liu Che, grandson of Emperor Wen and son of Emperor Jing. He had grown up in an age where modesty was a virtue and caution a creed. At meals, his grandfather had eaten from clay dishes instead of gold. His father had walked barefoot through the fields to show solidarity with the people. Those gestures, meant as examples of virtue, left the young heir restless. To him, restraint was not wisdom, it was confinement. He wanted to see how far the empire could reach before heaven itself intervened. In the second year of his reign, he summoned his ministers and declared that the time of inaction was over. To keep peace, he said, one must sometimes disturb it. Courtiers bowed deeply, uncertain whether they were hearing courage or madness. A boy had become emperor. Within him, ambition had already grown old. His first acts were symbolic but telling. Court music, long dominated by Taoist hymns of serenity, was replaced by martial compositions drawn from the border provinces, songs of drums and horns, of galloping hooves. He restored the use of bright scarlet in imperial ceremonies, a color banned under his father for being too extravagant, and he ordered sacrifices to heaven and earth at Mount Tai, a rite reserved for emperors who believed themselves chosen by destiny. The empire had found a ruler who thought not of stewardship but of grandeur. At the time of his accession, China stretched farther than any civilization on earth. Yet to the young sovereign, the maps seemed incomplete. To the north, the Xiongnu still roamed the steppes, occasionally raiding the frontier towns despite the marriage treaties that had bought a century of uneasy peace. To the west lay lands of rumor, oases, deserts, and distant kingdoms known only from the tales of merchants. The south, lush and humid, remained home to tribal peoples who resisted taxation and refused to speak the imperial tongue. In all directions, he saw not boundaries, but unfinished work. He surrounded himself with men who shared his vision. Among them were 2 generals whose names would become legend: Wei Qing, a disciplined commander of calm judgment, and his nephew, Huo Shubing, barely older than the emperor himself, fierce, daring, and beloved by the soldiers. From scholars, he sought counsel not of moderation, but of method. The philosopher Dong Zhongshu persuaded him that heaven favored rulers who upheld virtue through action, and that action meant expansion. Thus, Confucianism, once a quiet philosophy of conduct, became the ideological banner of empire. Before striking outward, the emperor consolidated within. The lingering fiefdoms of his father's era were dissolved, their lands absorbed into the central administration. Taxes on landowners increased, while trade monopolies on salt, iron, and coinage were placed under imperial control. It was an economic revolution cloaked in moral language. When profit belongs to the state, he declared, the people will forget greed. Merchants grumbled but obeyed. The empire's treasury filled, and with it, the war chests of his generals. The first campaign came in 133 BC against the Xiongnu. Years of marriage alliances had failed to pacify the steppes. The emperor ordered a massive ambush at Mai, baiting the nomads with the promise of a defector willing to deliver the city to them. The plan was betrayed, the trap collapsed, and the Xiongnu escaped unscathed. The young ruler took the failure personally. He summoned his generals and swore that the empire would never again bow to the horsemen of the north. The long peace was over. The wars that followed would define his reign. Under Wei Qing and Huo Qubing, the Han armies rode deep into the grasslands, chasing the nomads through winter storms and burning sun. Campaign after campaign pushed the frontier farther west, securing the Hexi Corridor, that narrow chain of oases leading towards Central Asia. In one battle, Huo Qubing led 10,000 cavalry across the desert, striking the enemy camp at dawn and capturing their sacred golden statues. The emperor ordered these trophies displayed in the ancestral temple, a warning to heaven's rivals that the Son of Heaven feared no wilderness. Each victory demanded a new frontier. Fortresses rose along the Gansu corridor, garrisons filled with settlers and prisoners alike. Beacon towers lit the nights from mountain to mountain, carrying signals faster than any messenger. From these strongholds, traders began to venture westward, opening the first routes that would one day be called the Silk Road. For every mile conquered, a new road appeared, a new commandery founded. Empire became geography written in stone, but expansion was never free. The northern wars drained silver and grain faster than any peace could replenish them. Peasants were drafted to haul supplies across desolate plains where water froze in the barrels and horses died standing upright. Whole provinces starved while the emperor built temples to celebrate victory. Still, he pressed on. Heaven, he said, is inexhaustible. Should a ruler hesitate while heaven moves forward? His conviction burned hotter than logic, and the ministers who questioned him were dismissed as cowards. Even so, his reach was astonishing. To the south, imperial armies marched into the jungles of Nanyue, the lands that now make up modern Guangdong and northern Vietnam. Local kings were subdued, their capitals annexed, and the empire's southern border reached the edge of the tropical seas. To the east, envoys crossed the rivers of the Korean peninsula, establishing command over Women Joseon. For the first time, the Emperor of Han ruled lands that touched 3 seas and 4 climates. The Middle Kingdom was no longer middle, it was vast. In the west, he sought not conquest alone, but understanding. He dispatched Zhang Qian, an envoy and explorer, on a perilous mission through the deserts beyond the Hexi Corridor. Captured twice by the Xiongnu, Zhang escaped after 10 years, returning with tales of rich kingdoms in the far west, Daiwan, Daxia, Anxi, places filled with strange horses and goods from lands even further beyond. His journey transformed the empire's imagination. The emperor listened for hours as Zhang described merchants who traded spices, glass, and wool across mountains that touched the sky. That night, he looked upon the maps of his realm and said, "So the world is larger than my banners." For all his grandeur, the ruler was no mere conqueror. He was also a builder of institutions. He founded the Imperial Academy, where scholars studied the Confucian classics to prepare for government service. It was the first step toward a meritocratic bureaucracy, rule by learning rather than lineage. Virtue, he proclaimed, must be tested as iron is tested by flame. Thousands of students memorized the Analects by lamplight, hoping their knowledge might one day raise them from obscurity. Education, once the privilege of the few, became the empire's new ladder. Yet the emperor's brilliance carried a shadow. In his later years, paranoia grew where confidence once stood. Accusations of witchcraft and treason spread through the court. Nobles were executed for omens that displeased him. Alchemists imprisoned for failing to deliver immortality. The pursuit of power that had built the empire began to consume its builder. Ministers who had once stood proudly before him now bowed, trembling. Even Wei Qing died anxious that some rumor might outlive him. His body, worn by decades of campaigns and rituals, began to fail. He spent long nights in the Gangquan Palace, surrounded by magicians who promised elixirs brewed from cinnabar and jade. None worked. When his beloved general Huo Kubing died at 23, the emperor wept openly, the last time anyone saw tears on his face. He lived as the empire should, he said, swift and without fear. That year, he ordered Huo buried near his own future tomb, a symbolic guard for eternity. In his final decade, Emperor Wu turned inward. Wars had slowed, but not the costs they left behind. Taxes rose, peasants fled their fields, and unrest spread quietly through the countryside. He saw at last the burden his ambition had placed upon the people. In 89 BC, he issued the Edict of Repentance, admitting his errors and ordering the release of prisoners convicted under false charges of witchcraft. "I have sought heaven's favor and found its silence," he wrote. "Let those who have suffered under my ignorance return to their homes." Few emperors in history would ever apologize so openly. When he died in 87 BC, after 54 years on the throne, his empire stretched farther and reached deeper than any before it. The commanderies of the West touched the edges of Central Asia. The garrisons of the South watched over the tropical seas. Trade flowed through deserts and mountains that had once been myth. Yet the grandeur he left behind came at a price: an exhausted treasury, a weary people, and a legacy of centralization that future rulers would struggle to bear. His tomb, the Maoling Mausoleum, rose like a small mountain on the plains west of Chang'an. It was said that from its summit one could see the Great Wall glimmering to the north and the rivers winding south toward the sea, symbols of the empire he had bound into one. At his funeral, courtiers wept, soldiers bowed, and poets spoke of him as the son of heaven who reached for the stars. But in the villages, an older saying passed from mouth to mouth: heaven expands and contracts as it pleases. Men who reach too far learn its weight. For now, the empire he built stood unshaken, a colossus of roads, walls, and laws. Yet beneath its surface, the quiet strains of imbalance had begun to hum. In the decades to come, that hum would deepen into fracture. But no one in that winter of mourning could imagine it. They saw only the marble palaces gleaming in the frost, the banners rising over every horizon, and the name of Han written across the world. like the morning sun over endless land. Snow fell thick over the Maoling mausoleum in the winter after Emperor Wu's death. To the mourners gathered outside its gates, the white fields looked endless, as if the empire itself had turned to frost. In 50 years of rule, he had carried China farther than any ruler before him, beyond deserts, across mountains, into lands the court astrologers had once marked as myth. Yet now, under the silence of his passing, the true weight of what he had built began to settle. The boy who inherited that weight was Emperor Zhao, only 8 years old. His enthronement brought relief as much as grief. After decades of war and ritual, the ministers longed for quiet. Real power fell to the regent Huo Guang, half-brother to the late General Wei Qing, a man famed less for brilliance than for patience. Huo ruled not through spectacle, but through stillness. Where the old emperor had filled the air with decrees, the regent filled it with silence. The empire he oversaw was both immense and fragile. Roads built for war now carried tax collectors. Garrison towns on the steppe relied on supplies hauled from provinces 1,000 ely away. The treasury, once overflowing, stood half empty. Farmers in the heartland complained of exhaustion. Fields lay fallow where soldiers had once marched. The banners of victory that fluttered on the palace walls had begun to fade in the sun. Huo Guang understood that what the sword had won, moderation must now preserve. He reduced military expenditures, recalled frontier troops, and lifted levies on grain. Monopolies on salt and iron, instituted to fund the old emperor's wars, were scaled back, easing the burden on merchants. Let the empire breathe, he told his advisors, before it forgets how. His measures worked. Within a few years, prices stabilized, famine receded, and caravans again passed safely along the western roads. The child emperor grew beneath his regent's shadow into a mild and studious youth. Courtiers praised his temperance and simplicity. He wore plain robes, refused excessive ceremony, and banned the use of golden vessels at court. When an official proposed erecting a new palace to rival the splendor of Emperor Wu's, Zhao declined, saying, "A ruler's virtue is his best wall." For 13 years, his quiet reign restored confidence to a weary nation. Yet even moderation bears its limits. As trade expanded and wealth accumulated, inequality deepened. Powerful families bought entire villages, turning peasants into tenant laborers bound by debt. In the capital, nobles competed to display their riches. Silk dyed in foreign colors, wine from southern orchards, jewelry from the deserts of the west. The regent could restrain armies, but not appetite. When Emperor Zhao died without an heir, Huo Guang faced a dilemma that would decide the century. The court looked to him to choose a successor. He selected a distant relative, Emperor Xuan, a man of humble origin, raised among commoners after his father's execution in the witchcraft purges of Emperor Wu's later years. His selection was bold, even dangerous, yet it proved inspired. The new ruler understood hardship as few emperors ever had. Xuan entered the palace with the caution of someone who had learned to survive by silence. He bowed to the officials who once would have bowed to his father, then began the slow work of rebuilding trust between ruler and ruled. The empire's wounds from its age of conquest were not physical alone. They were moral. Heaven's mandate, he told the court, is not won through fear. To the astonishment of his ministers, he offered amnesty to thousands imprisoned under false accusations of sorcery. Temples once closed under suspicion were reopened. Confiscated lands returned to their owners. Under his hand, the Han revival began. taxes were standardized and the imperial archives reorganized. Roads were repaired, not for invasion, but for commerce. Trade with the western states through the Hexi corridor flourished again, bringing back horses, jade, and new grains that thrived in northern soil. In the markets of Chang'an, foreigners became a common sight. Men with high noses and wide eyes selling spices and glassware the locals had never seen. The world that Emperor Wu had conquered by force was returning peacefully through trade. The regent Huoguang, now aging, continued to serve faithfully. He avoided titles, built no mansion, and died in his bed, a rarity among powerful men. After his death, the emperor personally attended his funeral, ordering that the man who had once ruled in his place be buried beside the generals of the great wars. It was a gesture both political and human. He kept the empire whole, Xuan said, when its heart had almost broken. Peace under Emperor Xuan lasted nearly a quarter century. His reign saw scholars restored to influence, astrology regulated, and the bureaucracy reformed. A new class of officials rose through examination rather than birth. Many trained in the Imperial Academy, founded by Emperor Wu. Confucian ideals became not just doctrine, but daily practice. Benevolence balanced by order, mercy tempered by discipline. The empire found equilibrium again, though it was the hard-earned kind that follows exhaustion. Yet no dynasty escapes its own gravity. As the frontiers stabilized, complacency crept back into the capital. Eunuchs gained new favor as intermediaries between emperor and ministers. Great families, once restrained by earlier reforms, rebuilt their fortunes. By the end of Xuan's reign, whispers of corruption and intrigue echoed through the corridors of the palace. Still, the people remembered him as the restoring emperor, and when he died in 49 BCE, the streets of Chang'an were lined with mourners who threw handfuls of grain in mourning, a tribute once reserved for gods of harvest. After him came Emperor Yuan, a man of scholarly disposition but weak constitution. He surrounded himself with philosophers and mystics, neglecting the discipline that had anchored his father's rule. Court debates turned from policy to ritual, whether dragons were omens of heaven's favor, or how many strings a ceremonial lute should carry. The ministers spoke of virtue, the granaries quietly emptied. Still, the empire remained vast and mostly at peace. Along the northern borders, the Xiongnu Confederation had fractured into rival factions, many of which now paid tribute to Han instead of threatening it. Diplomats married their daughters to Chinese nobles, adopting silk and etiquette in place of spears. In distant commanderies, officials sent back reports of stability and harvests, though their words often disguised decay. Outwardly, the empire glittered. Inwardly, cracks had begun to spread. The scholar emperor's court became a maze of factions. Confucian purists argued that the state had become too indulgent. Legalist bureaucrats urged a return to strict control. Eunuchs, entrusted with the emperor's private correspondence, began to wield unseen power. One minister warned that those who guard the door now rule the house. Yuan dismissed him. He preferred harmony to confrontation, and so corruption learned to smile. When Emperor Cheng, Yuan's son, came to the throne in 33 BCE, indulgence replaced restraint entirely. The young ruler was handsome, poetic, and easily bored. He adored spectacle, the scent of incense, the shimmer of brocade, the dance of courtesans. His favorite among them, Zhao Feiyan, was said to move so lightly that her feet left no trace in sand. The poets called her the feather flying at dusk. Under their reign, the palace glittered, but its foundations thinned. While the emperor reveled, the provinces suffered. Wealth pooled in the capital. Estates expanded while small farmers lost their land. Famines struck in the northwest. Floods broke the dikes of the Yellow River. The people looked to heaven for signs, and heaven replied with comets, earthquakes, and storms. Confucian scholars warned that such omens reflected imperial negligence, but their memorials went unread. In the music of the court, dissent had no rhythm. The once strong bureaucracy began to rot from within. Officials bought their appointments. Sentences could be altered by bribes. Eunuchs sold access to the emperor's ear, while noble families carved out fiefdoms behind the facade of loyalty. The empire, wrote one historian, was rich in surface and poor in root. Yet the memory of the golden age still lingered. People spoke of Wen and Jing as a dream, of Wu as thunder, and of their own time as echo. It was amid this echo that a new figure began to rise. Wang Mang, nephew of the Dowager Empress Wang Zhengjun, consort to the late Emperor Yuan. Polite, austere, and deeply versed in the classics, he appeared to embody the virtues the age had lost. Courtiers praised his modesty. He rode in plain carriages, wore hemp instead of silk, and spoke always of ancient virtue. Beneath that humility lay calculation. He understood that when a dynasty grows weary, the man who promises restoration becomes its heir. By 9 BCE, famine stalked the north again. Locusts devoured crops. The Yellow River shifted its course, drowning thousands. The omens that had once warned emperors now terrified them. Ritual sacrifices multiplied. Grain was wasted on offerings to heaven while the people starved. When the altars are full, one chronicler wrote bitterly, the barns are empty. Among the hungry, rumors spread that the mandate of heaven had left the Liu family and sought another host. When Emperor Cheng died without an heir, his nephew ascended as Emperor Ai. But he too proved weak, ruled more by affection than principle. His love for a young courtier named Dong Xian scandalized the ministers, who muttered that the empire had fallen under the rule of the pillow. Corruption deepened, harvests failed, and rebellion simmered at the borders. Still, in the chaos, Wang Mang's reputation for virtue only grew. He served as regent, first in fact, then in name, his control tightening with each imperial death. By the final years of the 1st century BCE, the Han world stood at a crossroads. Its armies still guarded deserts and seas. Its scholars still copied the classics. But faith in the dynasty's mandate had begun to erode. The poor cursed the landlords who grew, rich from their labor. Nobles cursed heaven for sending floods. In the capital, omens were debated more fiercely than policies. The empire that Emperor Wu had built through ambition and Huo Guang had steadied through discipline was now drifting under the weight of its own magnificence. On winter nights, the wind swept through the empty courtyards of Maoling, rattling the frozen reeds that grew around the emperor's tomb. Travelers said they could still hear horses' hooves in the distance, the echo of armies, long vanished, chasing horizons that no longer needed to be conquered. Within those echoes lay a truth the dynasty had yet to face, that the greatest burden of empire is not expansion, but endurance. Through the long corridors of the Weiyang Palace, silence ruled more firmly than any emperor. Dust gathered on jade railings, and the painted dragons on the walls had begun to fade. Courtiers still bowed at dawn, reports still passed from hand to hand, but something unseen had shifted. The empire that once thundered beneath Emperor Wu now moved as if walking in its own shadow. When Emperor Zhao died without an heir in 74 BC, the court trembled with uncertainty. Ministers argued behind closed doors, each fearing the return of chaos. Only one man stood unshaken, Huo Guang, the old regent who had guided 3 emperors already. He chose a quiet successor, Liu Bang, a distant relative of the imperial line who had survived the purges of Wu's last years. Crowned as Emperor Xuan, he entered the palace not as a prince restored, but as a man who knew hunger and loss. In his first audience, he bowed before his ministers and said, "I have been a subject longer than I have been a ruler. Let me remember what both mean." That humility set the tone for a reign that would bring brief renewal to a weary empire. Under his partnership with the cautious Huo Guang, the government turned from conquest to repair. Soldiers were recalled from distant outposts, fields were resettled, and the Hexi corridor, long scarred by war, filled once more with traders from the west. In Chang'an, markets shimmered with glassware, jade, and the rare blue dyes of distant lands. For 2 decades, the realm prospered in stillness, but even peace, left unguarded, breeds its own decay. The bureaucracy, swollen by the demands of empire, began to creak under its own weight. Reports arrived months late. Orders went unanswered. The emperor, patient by nature, ruled through written words that took longer and longer to find their way back. His vision was wide, but his reach no longer was. When Huo Guang died in 68 BC, the balance he embodied vanished. His descendants, long accustomed to quiet power, mistook privilege for right. Within a year, the Huo family's corruption became undeniable. In a single sweeping edict, the emperor ordered their annihilation. The purge restored authority, but it also erased the last living reminder of the discipline that had once guided Han's restoration. Even so, Xuan remained among China's most capable rulers. He traveled the countryside in plain robes to hear grievances himself, reduced punishments for minor crimes, and released those imprisoned for unpaid taxes. Peasants called him the listener. His death in 49 to BC ended an era of careful balance, and with it, the empire's last breath of restraint. His son, Emperor Yuan, inherited stability and smothered it in scholarship. Learned, gentle, and indecisive, he filled his court with Confucian philosophers who debated ritual propriety while the provinces decayed. Petitions piled unanswered. Famine crept through the countryside, and noble families grew rich on confiscated farmland. In the words of one minister, the people read classics by candlelight while their children starve. Under Yuan's son, Emperor Cheng, the decline deepened. Handsome, poetic, and easily swayed, he turned his court into a theatre. Dancers and poets replaced generals and ministers. Among his favorites was Zhao Feiyan, whose beauty was said to make silk tremble in her hands. Under her influence, the palace glittered with luxury unseen since Wu's days of conquest. For the first time in decades, the empire celebrated again, but the feasts were paid for with the people's hunger. While music filled the palace, disaster stalked the land. In 22 BC, locusts devoured the northern harvest. 3 years later, the Yellow River overflowed, drowning entire provinces. Refugees wandered the roads barefoot, eating bark and weeds. Officials minimized the damage to please their emperor, and Cheng responded with prayers instead of policy. He built altars, burned incense, and waited for heaven's forgiveness. None came. The scholars at court began to whisper what no one dared say aloud, that the mandate of heaven had begun to drift. The empire's disasters, they said, were not accidents of weather, but reflections of moral failure. When rulers feast, one memorial warned, heaven starves. Cheng ignored it. Faith in divine order, once the empire's spine, began to bend. It was in this atmosphere of exhaustion that a new figure rose to prominence. Wang Mang, nephew of the Dowager Empress Wang Zhengjun, widow of Emperor Yuan. He was everything the moment demanded, humble in dress, eloquent in virtue, unwavering in ritual. He donated his salary to the poor, rode in an unpainted carriage, and quoted the ancient Zhou texts with perfect precision. Courtiers whispered that heaven had sent a sage. The dowager called him her second son. Beneath his humility, calculation thrived. Wang Mang understood that in a decadent age, virtue itself becomes power. While the emperor indulged his passions, the nephew built a network of allies, scholars, clerks, and minor officials who believed he alone could restore the empire's moral order. He positioned himself not against corruption, but above it. The empire, weary of indulgence, mistook control for conscience. When Emperor Cheng died without an heir, chaos returned. The throne passed to a child, Emperor Ai, whose reign lasted only 6 troubled years. He adored a young courtier, Dong Xian, with a devotion that scandalized his ministers and left governance in neglect. Upon his death, Dowager Empress Wang again assumed regency and adopted a boy from the imperial line as Emperor Ping. Wang Mang, already her chief advisor, became the boy's guardian in name and master in fact. Behind closed doors, he tightened his hold on the machinery of state. Edicts required his signature before reaching the throne. Officials were chosen from his supporters. Even the imperial guards took orders from his kin. He issued moral reforms, bans on luxury goods, reductions of interest rates, new rituals praising frugality, and each made him appear as savior rather than usurper. Propaganda became prayer, obedience a kind of faith. Meanwhile, heaven's anger did not fade. In 11 BC, famine returned. The Yellow River burst its banks, changing course and drowning entire regions. Fields vanished beneath silt, and 500,000 people fled the floodplain. Crops failed, taxes fell, and local revolts flared across the north. The emperor's decrees to end suffering arrived weeks late, written on paper too fine for starving hands. Then came omens. Comets burned across the sky. Stones inscribed with mysterious characters were said to rise from the earth. Astrologers proclaimed that heaven was sending signs of renewal, a new era, a new virtue, perhaps even a new dynasty. Wang Mang seized the moment. He declared that the inscriptions foretold the coming of a true sage who would restore the lost order of the world. No one needed to ask who that sage was meant to be. When Emperor Ping died suddenly in 6 AD, rumor blamed poison. The dowager, broken by grief, withdrew from public life, leaving her nephew as acting ruler. Soon, a fresh vision was reported. A red dragon flying over the river, and a white stone unearthed bearing words in golden script. Wang receives the mandate of heaven. Officials carried the stone to the palace in solemn procession, and the people, desperate for stability, bowed before it. In 9 AD, amid processions of priests and scholars, Wang Mang announced that heaven had chosen him to restore the ancient order. He named his new dynasty Xin, meaning renewal. The boy emperor was dismissed with honors. The calendar reset. The Han name was struck from the official seals. After 4 centuries, the dynasty of Liu had fallen without a sword drawn. For a moment, the new ruler seemed to fulfill his promise. He dressed simply, spoke of justice, and decreed sweeping reforms. Land redistribution, state control of markets, fixed prices for grain, and the abolition of private slavery. He claimed to rebuild the golden world of the Zhou sages, but ideals forged in scrolls rarely survive the fields. The bureaucracy could not enforce his decrees, Noble families refused to surrender their estates. Peasants, confused by new coinage and taxes, rebelled. What was meant to renew the world only deepened its fracture. Across the countryside, rebellions spread like a bruise beneath the skin. Bandits called themselves Children of Han, promising to restore the old dynasty. Floods and famine returned, and armies sent to quell them joined instead. Within a few years, the Qin regime ruled little beyond the walls of Chang'an. The same heavens that had once blessed Wang Mang now turned against him. Comets appeared again, this time seen as curses. In 23 AD, rebels stormed the capital. The self-proclaimed Son of Heaven was cornered in his palace, still quoting scripture as soldiers broke down the gates. He died where he had first proclaimed his virtue, surrounded by the ruins of his own perfection. The dynasty he had invented vanished as quickly as it had appeared. From the ashes of that failure, loyalists rallied under a descendant of Emperor Jing, a man named Liu Shu, calm, pragmatic, and unpretentious. His banner bore one word: Han. Across 4 centuries, the name still carried the weight of legitimacy. Peasants joined him by the thousands, nobles offered support, and by 25 AD, the mandate of heaven had shifted again. The Han Dynasty rose once more, scarred but alive, reborn as the Eastern Han. In the ruins of Weiyang Palace, the wind moved through empty halls that had once heard 100 voices of power. The banners of the new emperor hung fresh beside the ghosts of the old. The cycle of order and collapse, faith and hunger, had turned again. China had fallen into its own shadow and learned once more how to stand. The proclamation of the Qin dynasty was meant to sound like thunder. Instead, it arrived as an echo, loud in the capital, faint beyond its walls. On that day, in 9 AD, Wang Mang stood beneath banners embroidered with the words, "Heaven's Mandate Renewed." Courtiers bowed to the marble floor, commoners crowded the streets of Chang'an, and proclamations were read aloud in every province. Yet in the farmlands, where famine had never lifted, people asked the same question in disbelief. If the mandate has changed, why do our bellies remain empty? Wang Mang had taken the throne as a self-styled sage, claiming to restore the virtues of the ancient Zhou kings. He promised equality, order, and a moral renewal that would sweep away the corruption of the late Han. His early decrees dazzled the scholars, reforms that sounded like poetry: land divided among the poor, debts forgiven, the sale of slaves forbidden. But ideals written on silk carried little weight against hunger. The ministers who cheered his vision had no idea how to enforce it, and the governors who might have helped were the very nobles whose estates he planned to seize. At first, the new ruler mistook silence for obedience. Reports from the provinces came delayed or falsified. Taxes collected by corrupt officials vanished en route to the capital. The empire looked stable only on paper. The moment the reforms reached the countryside, resistance erupted. Landowners bribed inspectors. Peasants refused new coinage, and soldiers deserted rather than starve on fixed rations. By the end of the first year, rebellion had replaced reverence. Still, Wang Mang believed in the script of destiny more than the language of reality. He called himself acting Son of Heaven, as though even divinity were temporary. To fund his reforms, he introduced new copper coins of unfamiliar shapes, knives, spades, and rings, meant to symbolize the purity of ancient virtue. Markets collapsed overnight. Farmers refused to trade. Merchants fled to the borders, and grain, that once cost 10 coins, rose to 10,000. In the words of one chronicler, He sought to make heaven visible, but blinded the people instead. Then came disaster that no reform could contain. In 11 AD, the Yellow River burst its banks and carved a new course through the north. Entire provinces disappeared under mud and water. The survivors wandered south in search of food, their faces hollow, their voices hoarse from hunger. Crops rotted, famine followed. Locusts swarmed over what little remained. Wang Mang ordered prayers, sacrifices, and more decrees. None produced grain. As the floods receded, they left not renewal, but ruin. Refugees formed bands for survival that soon became armies. Some painted their eyebrows red and called themselves the Red Eyebrows, claiming to fight in the name of heaven's justice. Others, known as the Lulin, rose from the forests and hills of the south. Peasants joined them not out of ideology, but necessity. Their banners bore the word Han, a memory more powerful than any edict. To the starving, Wang Mang's new world was a lie. The old name still meant food, family, and order. As rebellion spread, the Xin armies fractured. Commanders who had once sworn loyalty began negotiating with rebels or turning against each other. Provinces declared autonomy, and roads became unsafe even for imperial couriers. In the capital, panic filled the air. Wang Mang retreated into ritual, ordering scholars to search ancient texts for prophecies that might confirm his legitimacy. When they found none, he forged them. New omens appeared conveniently. Stones inscribed with celestial writing, dragons seen above the clouds. The people no longer believed, but they listened. Hope, even false, was easier than despair. By 17 AD, revolt had become the empire's only language. Across the east, the Red Eyebrows took city after city, defeating Xin generals whose soldiers lacked rations and faith. In the west, the Lulin rebels advanced toward the central plains. Famine, plague, and civil war merged into one catastrophe. Those who survived told of villages where the living fed on bark, where parents buried their children beside roads choked with corpses. The new dynasty was barely a decade old, but it already looked ancient in ruin. Wang Mang, once a symbol of moral purity, grew paranoid and cruel. He blamed disasters on treacherous spirits, executing officials for failing to interpret omens correctly. Ministers whispered that the Son of Heaven had lost heaven's mind. Yet he refused to abdicate. If the mandate can leave me, he told his council, then it was never heaven's to give. He fortified Chang'an, raised new armies from the desperate, and prepared to defend an empire that no longer existed. The final blow came in 23 AD. The Red Eyebrows joined forces with other rebel groups and marched on the capital. The Imperial Guard fought for 3 days among the palace courtyards before collapsing. Fires spread through the city. The marble towers that had symbolized renewal cracked in the heat. Wang Mang, dressed in his scholar's robe, refused to flee. When soldiers broke into the throne hall, he stood before them, quoting the Book of Changes. Heaven's course is constant. Those who follow it endure. A soldier struck him down before he could finish. The Jin dynasty ended in blood and smoke. From the chaos, a single name began to circulate. Liu Shu, distant descendant of Emperor Jing and commander of a modest peasant army in the Central Plains. He was cautious where others were reckless, soft-spoken where others shouted. When asked why he fought, he replied, "Not to reclaim the past, but to make it breathe again." That sentence traveled faster than his armies. To a people starved of both food and certainty, it sounded like a prayer. By 24 AD, Liu Shu's forces had united many of the scattered rebel factions under the banner of Restoration Han. He advanced methodically, securing each province before moving on. promising lower taxes and fair justice. In contrast to Wang Mang's abstractions, his decrees were simple and direct. Reopen markets, rebuild dikes, restore the old coinage. Where his soldiers entered, the people offered grain instead of stones. His war was one of patience, not fire. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Kunyang. Wang Mang's remaining generals, commanding hundreds of thousands, besieged a small Han garrison of less than 10,000. For days, arrows darkened the sky, and thunder echoed from catapults. Then, at dawn, Liu Shu's reinforcements arrived from the north, striking the Shin army's flank. Confusion spread. Superstition followed. The rebels raised shouts that heaven had sent them. The Shin soldiers broke ranks, their lines dissolving into flight. By nightfall, the field belonged to Han again. That victory transformed a rebellion into a resurrection. Cities opened their gates to Liu Shu's banners. Officials pledged allegiance without a fight. Within months, he controlled the heartland, and by 25 AD, he entered the old capital, Luoyang. There, before a crowd of soldiers, farmers, and scholars, he ascended the throne as Emperor Guangwu of Han, the brilliant martial emperor. The dynasty had been reborn. The new ruler understood that conquest meant little without reconstruction. He abolished Wang Mang's chaotic coinage, restored private land ownership, and reduced corvée labor. To win the loyalty of the provinces, he pardoned former Shin officials who surrendered peacefully and recruited them into his administration. "We will rebuild faster with hands than with graves," he said. His restraint, learned through years of hardship, became the foundation of the Eastern Han. In the countryside, temples once closed in despair reopened. The people buried their dead and returned to their fields. Where the Yellow River had shifted its course, new canals were dug. Caravans resumed their journeys westward. Trade with Central Asia revived. Slowly, the roads of empire filled again, not with armies, but with merchants, monks, and travelers carrying news that the age of chaos had ended. Chang'an, the old capital of the Western Han, lay in ruins, so the emperor chose Luoyang as his new seat of power. Its position at the crossroads of north and south symbolized the unity he meant to restore. He rebuilt its walls from the stones of fallen palaces and planted trees along the avenues where armies once marched. The city became both monument and warning, a reminder that dynasties rise higher when they learn humility. Still, the cost of restoration was heavy. The population, once over 60 million, had fallen by half. Entire regions lay empty, their villages reclaimed by grass. The emperor's edicts encouraged migration, granting land to settlers willing to repopulate the devastated north. "Let each hearth that burns," he wrote, "count as a prayer answered." For the first time in a generation, the countryside glowed again with the light of cooking fires. In the years that followed, the Eastern Han strengthened what the Western Han had nearly lost: endurance. The new court adopted simpler rituals, smaller armies, and more careful budgets. Confucian learning remained the empire's spine, but the emperor tempered doctrine with pragmatism. The ancients spoke of virtue, he told his ministers, but they also ate. His balance between ideal and necessity became the model of his age. By the time of his death in 57 AD, Emperor Guangwu had restored the realm, reformed its governance, and ensured that the word Han, once again, meant stability. The empire's borders did not yet match the vastness of Wu's conquests, but its heart was stronger for having been broken. In rebuilding, China rediscovered not its destiny, but its resilience. And so the story turned again. Where the usurper's temples had crumbled, New shrines to the founder of the Eastern Han now rose. The peasants who once cursed heaven now offered incense. Travelers spoke of peace returning, of justice renewed. Yet in the quiet beyond the city walls, the wind that moved through the fields carried a familiar whisper, one the empire had heard many times before, that all harmony bears within it the seed of decline. For the moment, however, the world was whole. The name of Han, written once more upon the edicts of heaven, gleamed across the rivers and plains like sunlight after a storm. From the ruins of civil war, Luoyang rose like a city exhaled from dust. The air smelled of clay and new mortar. The clang of chisels replaced the sound of swords. Streets once choked by weeds were paved again, canals reopened, bridges rebuilt. It was not triumph that drove the laborers, but relief, the sense that chaos had exhausted itself at last. Over the gate of the reconstructed palace, a new inscription appeared. Heaven restored, the people renewed. At the center of this renewal stood Emperor Guangwu, the man who had brought the Han name back from extinction. He was not a conqueror in the style of Emperor Wu, nor a philosopher like Wen. He was, above all, a survivor, methodical, restrained, and allergic to grandeur. Having seen kingdoms collapse under the weight of ambition, he preferred the stability of moderation. When courtiers proposed building a new imperial tomb larger than Wang Mang's ruined mausoleum, he refused. "Let the dead rest beneath the earth," he said, "and let the living keep it fertile." His reign began not with celebration, but with repair. The empire he inherited was smaller than the one his ancestors had ruled. The north depopulated by famine, the south cut off by rebellion, the west half lost to independent warlords. His first victories were bureaucratic, not military. Land deeds were reissued, tax registers rewritten, coinage stabilized. The reforms were simple yet transformative. Where Wang Mang had sought salvation in idealism, Guangwu found it in arithmetic. To rebuild loyalty, he extended forgiveness. Former officials of the Xin government were offered amnesty if they swore allegiance. Farmers who had fled their land during the chaos were granted new plots without penalty. He who plants once more, he declared, is already loyal. The emperor's leniency softened the provinces faster than armies could. Resistance melted into participation. The wounds of usurpation closed in silence. Still, unity required defense. The northern frontier, where the Xiongnu had reformed their tribes, remained restless. In 46 AD, Guangwu sent trusted generals to secure the Gansu corridor and the western commanderies. Campaigns were cautious, limited strikes, followed by negotiation. Rather than erase the nomads, he offered them trade and peace, opening markets where horsemen exchanged cattle and furs for Chinese silk and grain. The policy worked. For the first time in generations, the borderlands experienced more barter than battle. While soldiers guarded the horizons, scholars rebuilt the empire's heart. The Imperial Academy, nearly destroyed during the Xin chaos, reopened its doors. Teachers lectured on the Confucian classics, now canonized as the state's guiding texts. Among them was Ban Biao, historian and thinker, who began compiling the story of the Western Han, a work his children would one day complete as the Book of Han, the dynasty's enduring chronicle. The age that had almost vanished was teaching itself to remember. Guangwu's rule marked a new kind of kingship, less thunder, more endurance. He avoided unnecessary wars, reduced taxes, and personally reviewed local petitions. He often walked the streets of Luoyang without guards, speaking with merchants and artisans. When asked why he traveled so openly, he replied, "A ruler who must hide from his people has already lost them. This humility, rare in emperors, gave his reign an air of steadiness that the people mistook for permanence. Yet beneath the calm, the scars of collapse remained visible. Vast tracts of farmland lay empty. Population had fallen by half. The emperor's edicts encouraging resettlement filled the valleys with migrants, farmers from the south, refugees from the west, convicts pardoned for the purpose of tilling soil. Each hearth lit in an abandoned village was celebrated as a victory. Inscriptions from the time call this era the rekindling. The capital reflected that slow healing. Luoyang's new avenues were narrower than those of Chang'an, its palaces simpler, its gardens less grand. But life returned. Markets overflowed with grain. Musicians played in taverns built from salvaged bricks. Foreign envoys came again from Central Asia, following the old Silk Road, reopened by the emperor's diplomats. Caravans brought back jade, glass, and the great horses of the Fergana Valley, while Han merchants carried silk and lacquer in return. The empire was once more a part of the world, not the whole of it. When Emperor Guangwu died in 57 AD, he left behind not monuments, but momentum. His posthumous title, the Brilliant Martial Emperor, honored his restraint as much as his victories. The empire he restored passed to his son, Emperor Ming, who inherited not ruin, but possibility. Ming, unlike his father, looked outward. He was fascinated by learning and foreign ideas, especially those arriving along the western routes. During his reign, envoys returned from Central Asia, bearing news of merchants who worshipped a sage called the Buddha. Intrigued, Ming sent emissaries to learn more. Tradition holds that they returned with sacred texts and Indian monks who carried images of their teacher on white horses. In gratitude, the emperor ordered the construction of the White Horse Temple outside Luoyang, the first Buddhist monastery in China. From that seed, a faith would grow quietly beside Confucian order, altering the empire's spirit for centuries to come. While new beliefs found footing, the government itself matured. Ming expanded the examination system initiated by his grandfather, requiring candidates to demonstrate not lineage, but literacy. The ideal of meritocracy, long discussed, rarely practiced, became tangible. Peasants' sons who excelled in study could now dream of office. In the words of one scholar, the brush has learned to climb as high as the sword. Militarily, Ming and his brother, Emperor Zhang, who succeeded him in 75 AD, extended the stability their father had built. They restored Chinese influence in the Tarim Basin, re-establishing protectorates over the oasis states and securing the Silk Road. To the north, the Xiongnu Confederation split into two rival groups. The southern Xiongnu, who accepted Han overlordship, and the northern Xiongnu, who retreated deeper into the steppes. The frontier, for the first time in generations, became a place of exchange rather than invasion. These victories filled the capital with confidence. Poets compared the empire to a rising sun. Historians called it a second golden age. Under Ming and Zhang, the Eastern Han reached its high noon. Temples gleamed with white stone. Scholars lectured beneath banners embroidered with Confucian maxims, and the roads stretching from Luoyang to the seas thrummed with carts and caravans. The old fear that unity might vanish seemed, for a while, impossible. In that prosperity, culture bloomed. Astronomy advanced under Zhang Heng, who would later invent the world's first seismograph. Artisans perfected paper-making techniques that replaced bamboo slips, allowing books to spread beyond scholars' circles. Silk weaving reached new refinement. Iron foundries in the north produced plows and tools that doubled harvest yields. Each innovation carried the quiet pride of a people rediscovering their craft. Yet prosperity brought temptation. As wealth concentrated, noble families began buying land again, repeating the patterns that had undone the Western Han. Large estates spread across the provinces, worked by tenants who paid rent in grain and labor. The emperor's decrees of restraint could not match the momentum of privilege. In Luoyang, new mansions rose beside the modest palaces of the imperial family. The empire's stability, so recently won, began to tilt under its own abundance. Even so, the first century of the Eastern Han remained one of confidence. The government, strengthened by bureaucratic reform, extended its reach into law, education, and commerce. Governors were evaluated not by lineage, but by results. The size of harvests, the number of disputes resolved, the peace of their districts. For a brief moment, the imperial ideal matched reality. In the emperor's lifetime, the roads were safe enough that a merchant could travel from Luoyang to the western deserts without escort, and a farmer could leave his tools by the roadside without fear of theft. Chroniclers described this as the Pax Sinica, a peace so deep that its name would echo for centuries. Beneath that calm, however, new ideas stirred. Buddhism's promise of personal salvation appealed to those untouched by Confucian hierarchy. Taoist sects preached harmony through withdrawal, warning that every dynasty carries within it the seed of its own exhaustion. The empire listened politely and returned to work, unaware that the next century would prove those warnings true. For now, though, the light of renewal filled the land. From Luoyang's towers to the rice paddies of the south, from the deserts of Gansu to the far edge of the sea, the empire of Han stood reborn, leaner, wiser, and radiant in its second youth. After centuries of war, famine, and false dawns, China believed once more that heaven's favor could last. And as the evening bells of Luoyang sounded across the rebuilt capital, their echoes carried not fear, but faith, that this time the harmony would hold. The empire glittered, but its brightness hid the cracks. In the age of Emperor He, Emperor An, and their successors, the Eastern Han appeared unshakable. The roads were busy, the markets full, and the temples heavy with offerings. Yet beneath that order, the quiet machinery of decline had begun to turn. The harmony that once defined the dynasty was no longer discipline. It had hardened into habit. In 105 AD, the scholar Kai Lun presented his invention of refined paper to the throne. It was hailed as a triumph of intellect, a gift to scholars and scribes. Books could now be copied faster and cheaper than ever before. The empire's memory grew vast, its self-awareness heavier. Histories multiplied, but so did decrees, regulations, and bureaucracy. The same tool that promised knowledge also fed the empire's appetite for control. At court, the emperors of this new generation inherited the empire's wealth, but not its restraint. Emperor He, though earnest in youth, soon fell under the sway of his mother, Dowager Empress Do, and her powerful family. The Do clan filled offices with their relatives, treating the empire as inheritance. Ministers bowed to the dowager before they bowed to the emperor. When he grew old enough to resent their shadow, he turned for allies to the palace eunuchs, the one group beyond the noble clan's reach. Their alliance began as necessity and ended as dependency. Eunuchs, once servants, became gatekeepers of imperial power. They carried the emperor's whispers and wielded his seals. Those who controlled access to the throne soon controlled the throne itself. Within a decade, eunuchs were governing ministries, selling appointments, and orchestrating executions. The court, which had once balanced power between scholars and nobles, now tilted towards secrecy and intrigue. Meanwhile, in the countryside, the balance between land and labor collapsed. Noble families, immune to taxation, absorbed the fields of poorer farmers. Tenant laborers paid rents so high they kept less than a quarter of their own harvests. Some sold their children to survive. Others joined the growing class of wanderers who drifted between provinces, too poor to pay taxes, too hungry to obey the law. Officials reported unsettled elements, but the emperor's attention was elsewhere, lost amid palace rivalries and omens interpreted for convenience. In 124 AD, a comet blazed across the sky, bright enough to cast shadows at midnight. Scholars warned that heaven was angry. The emperor ordered sacrifices at the ancestral temple, but the disasters that followed seemed to prove the scholars right. Floods broke the dikes of the Yellow River. Earthquakes struck the western provinces. Famine followed drought in the south. To calm the populace, the court issued decrees of self-blame, claiming the emperor's virtue had lapsed. But these apologies, printed neatly on Kai Lun's new paper, could not be eaten. Hunger did not forgive. The people's patience began to fray. Local uprisings broke out, not yet organized but persistent. Farmers refusing to deliver grain, laborers attacking granaries. Each was crushed quickly, yet each returned. In the provinces, governors responded with brutality, worsening the spiral. In the capital, eunuchs profited from selling pardons and exemptions. The empire had become a machine that fed on its own inertia. When Emperor An succeeded in 106 AD, he was young and untested. His grandmother, Dowager Empress Dung, ruled in his name, a capable woman who restored temporary balance. She reduced taxes, rebuilt flood defenses, and recalled honest administrators from exile. For a time, it seemed the dynasty might right itself. But when she died, the emperor dismissed her ministers and surrendered to flattery. His reign descended into indulgence, lavish hunts, endless banquets, and grand projects that emptied the treasury. He built pleasure palaces along the Luo River and filled them with courtesans who danced by torchlight, while famine spread through the countryside. The historian Ban Zhao, sister of the great chronicler Ban Gu, still served at court then. She had completed the Book of Han, the official record of the Western dynasty, and she wrote cautiously of what she saw. When virtue thins, ceremony thickens. Her words were both lament and prophecy. The empire's rituals grew ever more elaborate, even as its spirit diminished. By 125 AD, the treasury was drained. Corruption filled the void, left by governance. Eunuchs sold military commissions. Provincial lords taxed twice to pay both the state and themselves. Banditry became epidemic. Along the roads of Henan and Shandong, travelers moved only in armed groups. Even the wind, a poet wrote, travels with a knife. Yet in Luoyang, the court continued its feasts, sealing the city from the world outside its gates. The cycle of regencies and coups continued. Emperors came and went, some dying of illness, others of intrigue. Emperor Shun, who ruled from 125 to 144 AD, tried to restore order by curbing the power of eunuchs, but his own officials betrayed him. Each purge replaced one faction with another. None restored confidence. The bureaucracy thickened, the people thinned. Earthquakes, fires, and eclipses filled the records of his reign, heaven's commentary on human folly. In the countryside, despair sought meaning. Taoist preachers began gathering followers with promises of healing and equality. They spoke of the great peace that would follow the end of corruption, of yellow heaven replacing the blue. Their ideas spread like wind through the fields, whispered prayers that would one day erupt into revolt. For now, they were tolerated as harmless mystics. The court had forgotten that every faith begins as rumor. Under Emperor Huan, the decay reached the heart of the throne. The emperor, raised amid eunuchs, trusted them more than his ministers. They controlled the seals, censored petitions, and silenced dissent. Scholar officials, once the moral backbone of Han, found themselves exiled or executed for criticism. The people called the eunuchs the 10 attendants, though their number was far greater. Their names were spoken in fear. Their wealth rivaled that of nobles. When one scholar wrote a memorial comparing them to termites in the beams of the state, his tongue was cut out before the document reached the emperor's hands. Yet even decadence breeds culture. Luoyang remained luminous, a city of poets, astronomers, and artisans. The polymath Zhang Heng built his bronze seismograph in 132 AD, capable of detecting earthquakes hundreds of miles away. Astronomers mapped the heavens with a precision unmatched in the world. Physicians compiled new treatises on herbal medicine. Artisans refined glasswork, and philosophers debated the balance between Tao and duty. Civilization flowered even as politics withered, a paradox that would define China's cycles for centuries. But for the common people, brilliance meant little without bread. Taxation grew harsher as the treasury emptied. Unpaid labor for public works returned in the guise of voluntary service. Dikes broke again, this time left unrepaired. Famine followed flood, and flood followed drought. Peasants who could not pay fled into banditry or joined the wandering sects of faith healers. The countryside that had once sustained the dynasty was turning quietly against it. In 159 AD, a coalition of scholars, known as the Partisans, upright officials who condemned corruption, petitioned the emperor to dismiss the eunuchs. Their memorial spoke not in anger, but sorrow. When the pillars rot, even heaven must lean. The 10 attendants retaliated swiftly. Hundreds of scholars were arrested, beaten, or exiled. Books were burned, names erased from government rolls. The repression only strengthened the scholars' conviction that virtue had fled the court. They swore allegiance not to the emperor, but to moral truth. It was the birth of political conscience in Chinese history, and the death of obedience. By 168 AD, the Eastern Han had grown brittle. The emperor was a child. The regents, his mother's relatives, ruled through eunuchs who traded favors like coin. Outside the capital, bandit kings styled themselves as lords. Sectarian movements called for a world cleansed of corruption. The empire still functioned. Taxes collected, edicts issued, borders patrolled. But its heart no longer beat with conviction. What had begun as renewal had become inertia. In Luoyang, the great palaces still shone at dusk, their walls reflecting the red light of the setting sun. The markets bustled, the theatres sang, the streets filled with scholars quoting poems older than the dynasty itself. Yet to travellers approaching the city, that glow looked less like vitality than warning, a fire seen from afar. The historian who chronicled these years wrote simply, "The empire was vast, but its virtue was thin." He could not have known that within 2 decades, the yellow turban banners would rise across the land, tearing apart the illusion of peace. For now, the Han world floated in its final calm, suspended between memory and awakening. In the night sky above Luoyang, comets traced slow arcs of light, heavens writing across an empire that no longer knew how to read it. The wind that once carried songs of harvest now carried silence. In the villages of Henan and the plains of Shandong, The fields stood half-tilled, their furrows cracked by drought. Taxes still came, though harvests did not. Officials arrived to collect grain that no longer existed, dragging farmers away in chains. In the towns, the words Han Empire were still spoken with reverence, but without belief. The dynasty's body lived. Its soul had already begun to depart. When Emperor Ling took the throne in 168 AD, he was 15 and already surrounded by vultures. The eunuchs who had murdered his regents now ruled in his name, selling offices to the highest bidder. A post as governor, a generalship, even a provincial tax right, all had a price. The treasury, long empty, was filled again by corruption. Wealthy men bought power, desperate men bought survival. Justice became another market. In the countryside, faith replaced politics. From the hills of Shandong rose a preacher named Zhang Jue, healer and mystic, claiming to possess the secrets of the way of great peace. His followers said he could summon rain, cure disease, and speak with the stars. To peasants broken by famine, his words were salvation. The blue heaven is dead, he preached, and the yellow heaven will rise. The phrase became a prayer, then a prophecy, then a password. His disciples spread through the provinces disguised as physicians, carrying charms of yellow cloth, the color of renewal. The movement grew quietly, like a river beneath ice. Villages swore allegiance to the way of heaven, raising grain for Zhang Jue's cause. Local officials ignored them at first, mistaking devotion for harmless superstition. By the time the court understood, the sect's reach spanned 9 provinces. In the spring of 184 AD, tens of thousands rose together, their heads wrapped in yellow scarves, their voices chanting the same words. The world under heaven is in great chaos. After this, it will be at peace. The rebellion spread faster than any army could move. In the north, fortresses fell overnight as garrisons defected. In the south, peasants stormed granaries, distributing food in the name of heaven. For the first time in 4 centuries, the empire faced an uprising, not of nobles or generals, but of its own people. Officials fled their posts, cities sealed their gates. Panic reached Luoyang before the rebels did. Inside the palace, the emperor's advisors argued over omens while the eunuchs blamed one another. Precious time vanished in ceremony. When imperial troops finally marched, they found the provinces already burning. Villages were reduced to ash, roads lined with corpses. The court, desperate for loyalty, granted independent command to generals and governors, men whose names would soon define the next age. Cao Cao, Sun Jian, Liu Bei, and dozens more. Each raised their own banners, each fought in the emperor's name, yet each began to imagine ruling without him. The wars that followed were chaotic and cruel. The imperial army, hastily assembled, lacked rations and discipline. The yellow turbans, though untrained, fought with zeal. They struck where the government was weakest, supply lines, outposts, and villages that had no defenders left. Entire prefectures vanished from record. Even when the rebellion was crushed in battle, it survived in belief. For every field reclaimed, 2 more went untended. For every rebel slain, 10 more swore vengeance. The capital became a fortress of ritual denial. The emperor continued to hold banquets, declaring victories that existed only in reports rewritten by eunuchs. Ministers who spoke truth were dismissed. Those who lied were promoted. In the midst of famine, the palace gardens bloomed with imported orchids watered daily by servants carrying jars of melted snow. The people of Luoyang began to whisper that heaven had indeed changed its color. By 185 AD, the rebellion was fragmented but undefeated. Zhang Jue himself died of illness. his body hidden by disciples who claimed he had ascended to heaven. His brothers fought on, leading remnants into the mountains. The imperial generals reclaimed the central plains, but could not restore faith. Every province now had its own army, its own taxes, its own loyalties. The great bureaucracy that once governed China through words had splintered into 1,000 swords. As the fires of rebellion dimmed, a new danger emerged: the men who had extinguished them. Commanders who had saved provinces refused to lay down arms. Governors began appointing their own successors. The court, paralyzed by intrigue, sanctioned their autonomy in exchange for peace. In doing so, it signed away the empire's authority. China had become a patchwork of warlords, each professing loyalty to an emperor none obeyed. For a brief moment, it seemed the dynasty might endure through inertia alone. The yellow turbans were scattered. The throne still stood. The capital still held its ceremonies. Yet the moral center of the empire was gone. The scholars who once preached harmony now turned recluse, retreating into mountains and monasteries. Peasants, disillusioned with both rulers and rebels, followed wandering mystics who promised healing and prophecy. The Confucian order that had defined the Han world was dissolving into plural faiths, plural powers. Among those who fought to restore the throne, ambition outgrew duty. Cao Cao, once a minor officer, began consolidating troops under his command in the north. To the south, Sun Jian emerged as a commander of charisma and ferocity. In the west, a young provincial of noble descent, Liu Bang, gathered followers not through fear but through reputation. Their paths had not yet crossed, but the age of rebels was ending. The age of contenders was about to begin. Within Luoyang, decay had become visible. The outer walls were cracked, the treasury nearly bare. The 10 attendants, the eunuch faction, still held power, but their grasp was slipping. They enriched themselves while preaching loyalty, and when famine struck the city, they hoarded grain in their private storehouses. Soldiers muttered that the empire had no emperor, only parasites. In 189 AD, the child emperor Shao ascended the throne. His father's death had left a power vacuum that pulled the realm apart. Rival generals marched toward Luoyang under the pretense of cleansing the court. The capital became a battlefield of factions. Palaces burned. The eunuchs were massacred. The boy emperor was rescued, then captured again. His authority passed like a seal between stronger hands. The rebellion that had begun in the villages now reached the throne itself. By the century's close, the once unified empire was divided in all but name. The mandate of heaven, that invisible thread that had bound ruler and people for 400 years, had frayed beyond repair. The Han still existed on paper, but its heart had scattered into camps and provinces. The map of China no longer showed one realm. It showed a struggle without center. In the fields where Zhang Jue once preached, yellow cloth still surfaced in spring plowing, tangled in the soil like old roots. Farmers burned it quickly, afraid of attracting suspicion, yet some paused to remember. For them, the rebellion had not been evil or holy. It had simply been the only voice that had listened. The empire had survived its greatest uprising, but not its consequence. The storm had passed, yet it left the ground so fractured that no harvest could grow whole again. What followed would no longer be rebellion, but dismemberment, the final unraveling of the world that called itself Han. When the smoke of rebellion thinned, the horizon revealed 100 banners. Each bore the name of loyalty, each concealed ambition. The yellow turbans were gone, but their uprising had shattered more than provinces. It had broken the illusion that one throne could command all under heaven. After Emperor Ling's death in 189 AD, the capital became a battlefield of courtiers. Eunuchs clung to the boy Emperor Shao, hoping to use his seal to preserve their power. Outside the palace walls, rival generals marched toward Luoyang, claiming to rescue the empire from corruption. None came as saviors. Among them rode Dong Zhuo, a frontier warlord summoned from the west. Crude in manners, but swift in violence, he entered the capital at the head of his troops, ostensibly to protect the emperor. Within days, he had slaughtered the eunuchs, seized the throne, and replaced the young Shao with his pliant brother, Emperor Xian. The new ruler's crown rested on fear, his palace on ash. Luoyang's people soon learned to dread the sound of hooves. Dongzhuo ruled through terror, executing ministers at whim, confiscating estates, and taking the treasures of the dynasty for his own. The court, once the mind of China, became its wound. Scholars fled to the provinces, generals raised militias, and the empire's arteries clogged with civil war. There are many emperors now, one poet wrote, but none who govern. In 190 AD, a coalition of governors formed against Dongzhuo, led by Yuan Shao, scion of an old noble family. Their alliance, noble in purpose and hollow in unity, advanced toward Luoyang. Before they arrived, Dongzhuo enacted his final cruelty. He looted the palaces, emptied the granaries, and set fire to the capital. Flames devoured the marble towers. The bronze statues of ancient emperors melted in the heat. The smoke hung for weeks, blotting out the sun. The city that had been the empire's heart became its funeral pyre. Carrying the emperor with him as hostage, Dongzhuo retreated west to Chang'an, declaring it the new capital. Behind him lay a wasteland where scholars once lectured and merchants once sang. The burned stones of Luoyang became the empire's gravestone. The coalition disintegrated as quickly as it had formed. Ambition outlasted outrage. Each warlord returned to his province, claiming titles, hoarding troops, fortifying cities. The emperor's edicts, issued from exile, reached no one who cared. The Han court, once the axis of heaven and earth, had become a relic carried from camp to camp, a symbol of legitimacy traded among those who sought to rule without it. From this anarchy, three figures began to rise. Cao Cao, once a minor officer known for cunning, secured the north. With iron discipline and ruthless efficiency, he transformed his command into an army of order amid chaos. He gathered farmers displaced by war, promising them safety and food in exchange for service. "I do not rule by birth," he said, "but by survival." To those who followed him, the distinction mattered little. He was stability made flesh. In the south, Sun Jian, a soldier from modest origins, carved power from the ruins of rebellion. His victories across the lower Yangtze inspired his son Sun She, who built alliances through speed and audacity. The family's ambition would one day found the kingdom of Wu, but for now they were a force without territory, an army carried by will. Far to the west, Liu Bang, a man of imperial blood yet humble means, gathered followers not by fear or wealth, but by loyalty. His companions, Guan Yu and Zhang Fei, swore brotherhood beneath a peach tree, pledging to live and die as one. In an age of betrayal, their oath became legend. To peasants and soldiers weary of tyranny, Liu Bei's compassion seemed proof that virtue could still breathe. The emperor, meanwhile, remained a hostage to fortune. In 192 AD, Dongzhuo was assassinated by his own general, Liu Bu, whose rebellion plunged Chang'an into new chaos. The imperial court, battered and leaderless, fled east once more, wandering through the ruins of its own past. When it finally reached safety under Cao Cao's protection, the Son of Heaven was no longer ruler, but captive. A seal legitimizing his captor's power. Cao restored Luoyang's ruins enough to use them as a throne room. He rebuilt the roads, reopened trade routes, and declared his loyalty to the emperor. Though everyone understood where authority truly lay, his proclamations bore the imperial seal, his armies the imperial standard. To the warlords who opposed him, he offered choice: submission or annihilation. Many chose the former. Those who did not vanished. By 200 AD, Cao Cao's armies controlled the north and the central plains. The emperor sat beside him, silent, a puppet whose shadow gave shape to power. The empire, long since broken, had begun to condense into regions of control. Cao Cao in the north, Liu Bei wandering between allies, and Sun Si forging dominion in the south. China had entered the geometry of division that would later define it. 3 centers of gravity, equal in ambition, opposite in faith. Still, the name of Han endured, suspended between them. Every warlord claimed to fight for its restoration, even as their battles erased what remained. The emperor, carried from camp to camp, affixed his seal to decrees he no longer read. He was the ghost of legitimacy, haunting a country that had forgotten how to kneel. When Emperor Xian finally abdicated in 220 AD, handing the imperial seal to Cao Pi, son of Cao Cao, the ceremony was quiet. No armies clashed, no omens burned in the sky. The last emperor of Han simply bowed, surrendered the mandate, and stepped down from history. 4 centuries of unity ended not with rebellion, but with exhaustion. In the fields beyond Luoyang, where weeds grew over charred foundations, farmers still found fragments of roof tiles stamped with the character Han. They used them to mark graves or grind grain, unaware that they were touching the bones of an age. The empire that had called itself eternal had become another layer of earth. From its ashes rose 3 new realms, Wei, Shu, and Wu, each claiming heaven's favor, each destined to fade in turn. The world had not ended, it had only changed shape. Yet among the people, the old name lived on. To be Chinese still meant to be Han, not by law but by memory. The dynasty was gone, but its echo became identity. And so the story of 400 years closed not with defeat, but with inheritance. The mandate of heaven had moved on, yet the civilization it had sustained endured. Across the plains once scorched by war, the wind carried a single refrain, half lament, half faith. Empires fall, but the people remain. The fire that consumed the Han left no single victor, only survivors. In the ruins of Luoyang, smoke still curled through collapsed colonnades, mingling with the scent of wet ash. Farmers wandered through the wreckage searching for the graves of ancestors lost in the wars. Somewhere beneath that earth lay the bones of emperors and peasants alike. One dust, one silence. The dynasty was gone, but its shadow remained on every road, every river, every word. After 220 AD, China splintered into the rival kingdoms of Wei, Shu, and Wu. They fought not merely for land, but for legitimacy, for the right to inherit the world that Han had built. Each ruler called himself the true successor. Each claimed the mandate of heaven, and each preserved the rituals of the fallen dynasty as proof of continuity. Even in division, the name Han governed the imagination. It was no longer a dynasty. It had become a memory that refused erasure. From Luoyang's ruins, the state of Wei, led by Xiao Pi, inherited the machinery of empire. Bureaucrats copied the archives, generals rebuilt the walls, and scholars resumed their work as if continuity could be enforced by pen and decree. To the north, the kingdom of Shu under Liu Bei invoked bloodline and virtue. declaring itself the moral heir to the founders. In the south, Sun Quan's realm of Wu turned the wealth of the Yangtze into power, priding itself on prosperity rather than lineage. 3 courts, 3 emperors, one ghost of a nation that still called itself Han. The wars between them lasted half a century. Armies clashed at Red Cliffs, on the Wei River, and across the valleys once tended by peasants who now fought for kings they would never meet. Out of that chaos emerged not new ideals, but a desperate desire to remember the old ones. Historians of every state began writing the story of the Han, each version shaped by politics but bound by reverence. For the first time in history, memory itself became governance. By the time the Jin dynasty reunified China in 280 AD, 4 generations had lived and died since Han's fall. Yet the name still carried weight. In the north, nomadic tribes who conquered the frontier adopted Han titles to legitimize themselves. In the south, refugee scholars founded schools that continued to teach the Han canon, the Confucian classics that had outlasted the emperors who enforced them. The dynasty's death had become the empire's soul. Its influence stretched beyond government. The institutions the Han built, its bureaucracy, its written law, its merit-based examinations, became the grammar of Chinese civilization. Every dynasty that followed inherited its structure, just as children inherit the bones of their parents. To govern China was to speak in the syntax of Han. Even in failure, the dynasty had taught endurance. The wars that followed did not erase its ideals. They scattered them like seeds. Confucian ethics merged with Taoist introspection and the new voice of Buddhism, forming the triad that would shape East Asia's moral landscape for millennia. Scholars, once silenced by the eunuchs, returned as monks and philosophers, their robes different but their questions the same. What holds a world together when power fails? Artists found their own answers. In the Jin and later Tang dynasties, painters looked back to Han bronzes and reliefs for inspiration, carving the faces of ancestors onto stone with reverence. Poets invoked the Han not as an empire, but as an emotion, a symbol of order, grief, and belonging. One verse from the Song of the Lamented Age reads, "The palaces are gone, but their shadows stay, etched in the dust where children play. The empire fell, but the name remains, written in hearts as in the veins of plains." What made the Han endure was not its power, but its shape, the balance it found between unity and diversity. The dynasty had ruled over dozens of peoples, tongues, and gods, yet it taught them a single language of governance. When it collapsed, that language remained. The very concept of China, Zhongguo, the Middle Kingdom, was a Han creation. The idea that there could be one civilization bound by law, culture, and heaven's favor would outlive every throne built upon it. Even its failures became instruction. The corruption of the eunuchs, the decay of aristocracy, the arrogance of the court, all became warnings, preserved in later law codes and teachings. The Han had shown that empire could die from within as easily as from without, and that moral decay was the true enemy of dynasties. To later emperors, its fall was both a lesson and a mirror. In Luoyang, rebuilt once more under the Northern Wei centuries later, archaeologists unearthed the ruins of Han palaces, buried beneath layers of newer stone. Beneath one wall lay a foundation stone engraved with a single character, Ren, benevolence. It was the core of Confucian virtue, the moral axis of Han rule. Perhaps it had been carved there as prayer, perhaps as irony. Either way, the word survived the flames that erased the building above it. Beyond politics, the dynasty's reach extended into the very identity of its people. To this day, most Chinese still call themselves Han Ren, the people of Han. No other dynasty achieved that. The Tang, Song, and Ming would rule in their time, but none would become a synonym for civilization itself. The Han had fused empire with identity. Its name became the measure of belonging. The legacy of its governance lived on as the imperial ideal of balance between heaven's mandate and human virtue, between order and compassion. The empire's scholars had believed that moral harmony, not might, preserved the world. When later dynasties faltered, they looked backward, not forward, seeking renewal in what the Han had once represented. The dynasty became the moral past that every future ruler tried to imitate. Its reach stretched beyond China's borders. In Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, rulers modeled their courts, bureaucracies, and rituals after the Han example. Its script became the written backbone of East Asia, its philosophies the shared language of governance. Even when new faiths entered the region, they adopted Han vocabulary to explain themselves. The world did not forget it. It built upon it. Yet perhaps the dynasty's most enduring inheritance was its vision of humanity. In Han thought, the emperor was not a god, but the axis between heaven and earth, a mortal bound by duty to preserve cosmic balance. That idea survived conquests, foreign invasions, and revolutions. It taught that power was conditional, not absolute, that legitimacy required virtue. Across centuries of change, that principle endured like an invisible law written into the mind of China. In this sense, the fall of the Han was not an end, but a translation, from rule into meaning, from empire into memory. The dynasty ceased to exist. The civilization it shaped continued to define what existence meant. Even rebellion against order would use its vocabulary. To overthrow tyranny was to restore Han, a phrase that resurfaced in every uprising for 2,000 years. In the long arc of Chinese history, the Han stand like a mountain whose shadow still touches the horizon. They did not invent unity, but they perfected its form. They did not create culture, but they gave it continuity. Their laws, literature, and lineage turned a collection of kingdoms into a civilization that could fall 100 times and rise under the same name. By the time the Tang Dynasty flourished 8 centuries later, the Han were legend. Scholars looked back on them as the age when heaven and humanity moved in harmony. The Tang emperors traced their ancestry to Han heroes. Poets recited their victories as scripture. In their language, the past was not gone. It was present tense. And through that act of remembrance, the Han became eternal. Even today, in the flow of daily speech, their presence lingers. The word Han names not a dynasty, but a people, not an empire, but a mirror. It stands for continuity, intellect, endurance, the belief that civilization can survive its own ruin. The empire that fell in fire continues to live wherever written words preserve order against chaos, and wherever people look to heaven not for favor, but for meaning. 2,000 years after its founding, travelers still walk the remnants of its roads, now buried beneath asphalt and time. Beneath their feet, somewhere deep in the soil, lie bricks stamped with the imperial seal, symbols of a world that once believed harmony could be permanent. The dream proved mortal. The idea did not. As the sun sets over the plains once ruled by its emperors, the air carries a silence that is not loss, but continuity, the breath of a civilization that never forgot its first unity. The Han are gone, yet every dynasty that came after spoke in their voice. The empire of men became the memory of a people, and that memory became China itself